I'd like to thank you all for having me on this solemn and important occasion of Yom Shoah. What I thought I'd share with you this morning is an introduction to the history of the St. Louis. Hopefully I'm going to be showing actual photographs taken on board the ship. And I'll also be sprinkling in excerpts from my novel, which is a fictionalized account of the voyage. And my goal in writing this novel, and hopefully that will come across today here, is to bring to life this story. Yes, okay. So what you see on screen now, hopefully, is the cover of my novel, which was designed from an actual picture postcard of the St. Louis. So the St. Louis left Hamburg, Germany on May 13, 1939, bound for Cuba. The voyage departed 6 months after Kristallnacht. For many people living in Germany and Austria, the widespread and overt violence of Kristallnacht was the moment when they decided they had to leave their country. During this period before the war officially began, Jews still had the possibility of leaving Germany, although the Nazis made it very hard to do so. Boat tickets were extremely expensive at a time when most Jews had been forced to give up their jobs. A tourist class ticket on the St. Louis in today's dollars would have cost $5,000. So you can imagine if you had your whole family traveling, 4 people or so, this was a lot of money. Refugees also needed a visa for a country that would accept them, and such visas were scarce. At the time, even if you secured a visa and had money for the passage, those who left often had no choice but to leave relatives behind. Thomas is the main character in my book, and his family could only afford passage for one, so he's traveling alone. His older half-brother is already in Cuba waiting for him. Right now I'd like to read the first excerpt from the beginning of my novel where Thomas says goodbye to his mother and boards the ship. At the shed in Hamburg, his mother took him by both shoulders. They had traveled hours on the train from Berlin, and she would be making the return trip without him. Since arriving, they had passed an uncomfortable hour, rarely talking, as they waited for boarding to begin. Finally, it was time. Thomas stepped away from his mother. She had said no tears, but he could hear her muffling sobs in her sleeve. He inhaled the salty air as gulls screeched overhead. He looked up at the 2 giant funnels in the mast of the ship. A swastika flag flapped in the breeze. Why hadn't he noticed it before? Thomas shivered in his damp clothes. How could a ship that was supposed to carry its passengers to freedom bear the Nazi flag? The question Thomas asks is one that occupied the minds of many passengers as they boarded the St. Louis. After being treated so horribly in Germany, they were astounded at what awaited them on board the ship. The St. Louis was a luxury liner and had comfortable cabins, a grand dining room serving delicious food, a beauty salon, a gymnasium, a movie theater, a shipboard shop, and even a swimming pool. The St. Louis usually carried affluent passengers to lush vacations in the Caribbean. Now if we can go forward one slide, I'd like to show you some of the pictures from the St. Louis. This should be a photograph of the dining room while it's empty. As you can tell, it's quite grand, 2 stories high. Go forward again. We'll see 2 passengers playing table tennis, or what we might call ping pong. If we advance one more, we're at shuffleboard, another popular deck game. The question remains, why would the Germans let the passengers travel in such luxury? While there is no certain answer, speculation is that the Germans planned to use the voyage to prove to the rest of the world that the Nazis were not only allowing Jews to leave, but that they were treating them very well. On the morning of Saturday, May 27th, the St. Louis arrived in Havana Harbor. What the passengers soon learned, and the captain had already been aware of for days, was that they might not be allowed entrance. On May 5th, the Cuban government had passed a decree effectively voiding the landing permits that passengers had purchased before the voyage. The reasons for this action were complex and included infighting within the Cuban government and greed on the part of Cuban officials, who hoped to get the passengers to pay more money to be admitted. In addition, the Cuban government was in disagreement as to whether their weak economy could sustain addition to their population, and Germany had also been stirring up anti-Semitism in Cuba through propaganda. For a week, the passengers waited anxiously aboard the ship while the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, negotiated with the Cuban president. We can move forward one more. We'll see the passengers looking out of the ship. In my novel, Professor Affeld is asked by the captain to head up a passenger committee to act as a liaison between the powers negotiating and the passengers. There was such a committee on the actual ship, but despite its pleas on the behalf of the passengers, ultimately Cuba refused the St. Louis. The reason the other ship, the Orduna's passengers were accepted was because the Orduna had left port before the Cuban decree nullifying landing permits had gone into action. The decree went into law on May 5th, the day the Orduna left. The St. Louis left 8 days later. Captain Schroeder turned the St. Louis around but motored slowly, hoping it would give officials time to broker another solution. The St. Louis circled the coast of Florida, so close that passengers could see the lights of Miami, as the JDC appealed to the U.S. government and other countries as well to admit the passengers. When the U.S. declined, the ship headed back to Europe. After further frantic pleas and negotiation, the governments of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Great Britain agreed to take the passengers. I'd like to read one last scene from my novel where Priska has learned that she and her family are getting off in Antwerp. Thomas has still not learned where he will be going. Priska took Thomas's hand and they walked to the railing overlooking the quayside. Priska looked at the dock. I know, let's make a pact. Thomas furrowed his brow. If for some reason we don't find each other, in 5 years' time we'll meet. On this very day in 5 years, June 17, 1944. This craziness will surely be long over by then. I'll be 19 and you'll be 20. Thomas tried to imagine himself at 20, but couldn't. He couldn't even imagine what he'd be like an hour after Priska had left the ship. We'll meet in Miami, Priska continued. We'll both be in America by then. We'll meet by the harbor where the ships come in, where we would have docked. Thomas stared at her, trying to carve her features into his mind. All right, she asked. 5 years from this very day, Thomas repeated, if we don't find each other before then. Just like Thomas and Priska, the passengers on the St. Louis thought they were saved, and that in time their numbers would come up and they would find themselves in the U.S. To me, this is the most heartbreaking part of the story because, of course, looking back with our knowledge of today, we know that they were far from saved. The war broke out in September, and in 1940, the Germans invaded and occupied Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. Most of the passengers who were lucky enough to be randomly selected to go to England lived through the war. However, many of the others in time found themselves sent to concentration camps. 254 of the 937 passengers on the St. Louis perished in the Holocaust. The St. Louis left an indelible legacy in helping to shape our country's humanitarian treatment of refugees and influenced legislation such as the 1948 Displaced Persons Act and the 1980 Refugee Act. Because of our country's history as a safe haven for people facing persecution and seeking freedom, we must continue to struggle with the complex and controversial issue of how to decide how many refugees to admit. One of the passengers on the St. Louis that I interviewed for my book, Herbert Carliner, shared with me a personal anecdote regarding this subject. In 1980, over 100,000 Cuban refugees came to the U.S. in a mass exodus seeking asylum. Carliner was at first outraged that they were let into our country when he and his fellow passengers had been turned away. However, in discussing the issue with a fellow survivor, Carliner came to realize that it was because of the St. Louis that the Cuban refugees were let in, and that Carliner and the other survivors of the St. Louis should feel that their plight at least helped others. Finally, I'd like to pass around a basket I have with actual replicas of tickets from the St. Louis. Each has a passenger's name on it, and you can each take one, and there's a website at the bottom where you can find out what happened to your passenger.